I'm Laurel Westendorf. I'm part of the Deschutes Public Library Community Relations team. Every month we explore a theme, and this month's theme is fermentation. So it is very fitting that today we have fermentation revivalist Sandor Katz with us today to talk about dosas and other spontaneous fermentations of beans and grains. Sandor Katz is a fermentation revivalist. His books, and I'm sure a lot of us here have read a few of them, include Wild Fermentation and the Art of Fermentation. He's done hundreds of fermentation workshops around the world and helped catalyze a broad revival of the fermentation arts. And I know I'm probably not the first here that started my first sauerkraut after reading a book of Sandor. So I'm really honored and happy to welcome him here today. Thanks, Sandor.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Laurel. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I wish I was there in person. I love Bend. I have family in Bend. Shout out to my sister, Lizzie Katz, and my nephew who lives there, Kobe Koch, whose birthday is today. He's turning 22. So anyway, I have some Bend connections, and I love it in Bend. And over the course of the next hour, I am going to show you all how to make dosas. But I just want to start by contextualizing a little bit and just addressing a little bit the question, what is fermentation anyway? And broadly speaking, fermentation is the transformative action of microorganisms. The science of microbiology, which really only emerged a little more than 100 years ago, has given us a lot of insight and helped us understand the nature of fermentation. But fermentation has been part of cuisines all around the world since ancient times. I mean, fermentation is much older than writing, so we don't really know exactly when it started. And the oldest surviving documents in a number of different written traditions make reference to ferments that were already prominent in those parts of the world. Microbiology has enabled us to understand that everything we eat, all of the plants and all of the animal products that make up our food, are populated by microorganisms, and never by one singular organism, but always by these elaborate communities of organisms. And so, the big question in fermentation is which of these organisms are going to develop. And so, as we all see from, food decomposing that we lose track of in the refrigerator, one direction that microbial transformation of food can take is just decomposition. The bag of parsley forgotten in your refrigerator that, turns into a liquid. You don't pull that bag out and say, oh, look, the parsley fermented. We have different vocabulary for that. We call that, it's spoiled, it's rotten, it's decomposed. But that's one of the potential directions that the microbial transformation of the food can take. Another is, we have all these concerns about food poisoning, and we hear the names of certain bacteria that are associated with food poisoning. E. coli, salmonella, botulism. So that's another potentiality, is that pathogenic organisms that have the potential to make us sick can proliferate on our food. But fermentation, we reserve the word fermentation to describe desirable or intentional microbial transformations. And generally, there's a practical benefit to fermentation. The food is not decomposing into a disgusting, ugly mess, and it's becoming more delicious, or we're producing alcohol, or we are preserving food so that we're extending its useful life, or we're making something that's difficult to digest more easily digestible, or we're making nutrients more bioavailable to us, or we're removing some toxin from food, or we're making it so the food requires much less cooking. So there's always practical benefits of fermentation. Now, the preservation aspect of it has been really important, and people tend to emphasize that. And so, for instance, if you make sauerkraut, this is this is a strategy to preserve vegetables, and it also makes vegetables delicious, and it also preserves nutrients. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to it, but the primary practical benefit is that you're preserving the vegetables. So in temperate climates with limited growing seasons, this is really, really important because it enables people to have plant food during the winter time when there's no fresh plant food available. Similarly, cheese and yogurt and any kind of fermentation of dairy is a strategy for preservation. Milk is among the most perishable of foods, like really until the 20th century and widespread refrigeration, hardly anyone drank milk fresh. People who, were milking goats or cows could drink fresh milk, but, to the degree that other people were drinking milk, they were drinking clabbered milk. That's milk that is fermented and acidified. There's many forms of fermented milk. Cheeses are all fermented milk, yogurt, kefir, many other variations on the theme are examples of fermented milk, but all of them preserve the milk, extend the useful life of the milk. Today, we're focusing on the fermentation of grains and beans. Specifically to make dosas, which are these South Indian style crepes. But the concepts that I'm going to be introducing are really they're broadly applicable concepts. But nobody ever ferments grains or beans in order to preserve them, because in their mature state they're dry. This is a jar of buckwheat. I have another jar of rice. I have another jar of wheat. I have a jar of lentils. I have a jar of pinto beans, and they are shelf stable. Like, they don't need refrigeration as long as I keep them dry. And, out of direct sunlight will keep them fresher, cool will keep them fresher. But as long as they're dry, like, they are well preserved. And the first step in fermenting any of them is introducing water. And once you introduce water to the grains, you can do wonderful things with them, but you're not going to enhance their preservation value. They're going to preserve best just the way they are, by being kept dry. What fermenting them does is it unlocks nutrients, nutrient bioavailability. I would say that, the same qualities that make, grains and beans so storable, their dryness, their density, make them hard for us to digest. And so, for instance, the minerals that are found in grains are tied up in these chemical bonds, phytate bonds, that our digestion can't break down. So if we ferment them, one aspect of fermentation is bacteria are digesting nutrients before we eat them. And so one of the things they're doing is they're breaking down these phytate bonds. And, actually there have been studies in nutrition journals where, they take some rice and lentils and cook them and send them to a lab for analysis. And then they ferment them, make dosa, send them to a lab, and they can always find higher measurable levels of calcium, iron, and other dietary minerals, because these phytate bonds get broken down during the fermentation. The fermentation also, creates flavor. And, grains and beans have a, relatively plain flavor, but the fermentation, enhances that flavor with byproducts of fermentation, lactic acid and other minor byproducts, just give it a more complex flavor. Also, the fermentation produces carbon dioxide, which lifts everything up, and it just makes everything lighter. So there are definitely benefits to the fermentation, but the benefits of fermentation don't have to do with preservation. And also, unless you want to eat the batter raw, which I wouldn't recommend. It's not very delicious. Raw, you're not getting the probiotic aspect, which you do get with sauerkraut, but there are these other benefits, which are, the nutrient bioavailability and easier digestibility. And we can never lose sight of the fact that they're so delicious. So I see a question already. Do we need to soak rice to remove arsenic? Okay. I mean, honestly, I don't know that much about arsenic. You know, I mean, certainly for an application like this, I always soak the rice. Sometimes I soak the rice, otherwise, sometimes I don't. I don't really know about arsenic. You know, I'm interested in traditional food methods. Like I'm not really like a health guru or something like that. That's sort of like I'm not sort of like tracking every like nutritional critique of different foods. So I wish I could address the question about arsenic, but I don't know. But in any case, the first step for the fermentation is always going to be soaking. So here I have, these are red lentils soaked. I started with, last night when I soaked it, it was half a cup of lentils, and you know, they've doubled in size. So now I have a cup of soaked lentils that expanded. And then I soaked a cup of rice, which also expanded, but not quite as dramatically. So, so I soaked my lentils and my rice. In terms of proportions, I mean, generally my working proportion is about half as much lentils as rice. I've seen recipes that are all over the place. Most recipes use more of the grain than the lentils, but I have seen recipes that use more of the lentils than the rice. Sometimes I've made it like, you know, 4 parts rice to 1 part lentils. I mean, you can play with it. You can vary it. You know, fermentation is not rocket science. Like any, you know, like anything else that you prepare in your kitchen. You know, there's quite a bit of leeway in terms of proportions to use and such. I soaked these last night. You know, I would say 8 hours would be a good minimum. So you could soak them before you go to bed, and then make your batter in the morning. I should say that the red lentils that I'm using are not the traditional kind of lentil to use for a dosa. The traditional one would be, it's a lentil that is has white flesh and a black hull that are called urad dal. And so if you know, you can find those in an Indian market or on the internet, or you can just make it with lentils that you have easier access to. And by the way, you know, all of these processes can be you know, done with other ingredients. So for instance, you know, one time I just wanted to see, you know, how far you could push this concept. And I did it with millet and lima beans, and it worked out perfectly. So, I mean, you know, because this is something that's coming from the south of India, you know, it's typically done with you know, the common grains that are used there. But if you're somewhere else and there's some other, you know, grain or bean that's more accessible to you. Oh, I've also done this like Mexican style, using nixtamalized corn instead of rice, and pinto beans instead of lentils, and you know, it worked wonderfully. Like you really can vary as long as you have the same type of ingredients. Like grains and legumes are what go into this. So you soak the ingredients, and then what we're going to do is basically use a blender. You know, in India, people typically don't use a blender. I'm just going to use a blender like this. There's a tool that a lot of kind of contemporary middle class households in India have. It's called a wet grinder. They're not very common here. You don't necessarily have to have that. And then, of course, you know, the more traditional way is not using a machine at all, but just, you know, kind of using a mortar and pestle kind of a thing to break it down into a paste. So I'm going to make a batter to start fermenting. And then I'm going to show you a batter that I made yesterday that's already fermented and risen. And then I'll show you how to make a crepe, a dosa, out of that. One key is that you want to use as little of the soaking water as possible. You know, we'll need a little bit of it, but we don't want a lot of that soaking water. So I'm just kind of draining it a little bit and dumping the rest of the lentils into there. Then I'm gonna drain off excess water from the rice. And then dump the rest of the rice into the blender. And then I'll probably end up adding a little bit more of that liquid back in, but I want to just add as little as possible because, I mean, the biggest thing that you could do wrong with this is making the batter too thin. Because if the batter is too thin, then it's not going to be able to hold the bubbles and you won't be able to see it rise. And then it also will be so thin that it won't be able to, you know, maintain its cohesion as a pancake. So, okay, I've got them in the blender, and now I'm going to do some blender performance art. Turn on the blender, and okay, we're going to need a little bit more of this liquid. Stir things up in there a little bit. Okay. Things on the top are not falling down, so I'm just mixing it again manually. I hope you are all enthralled by the blender performance art. Great. So that's the batter, and then what I'll do, you know, later when I'm off is just pour it into a jar. You want to always make sure that your vessel is larger than the amount of batter that you have. So you want to make sure it has room to as much as double. Okay, I see some questions coming up. Do you add something acidic to the water like lemon juice? No. Just water. No whey. I mean, you could play around with whey, but that's certainly not the Indian way to do it. This is what Sally Fallon recommends. Okay, well, you know, you'll have to ask Sally about that. I don't know. Like, that's not, you know, it's not the traditional way that idlis or dosas are made. Can you use a food processor instead of the blender? Sure. I mean, you just want to make sure, like, if you have liquid too high in a food processor, it tends to leak out. So, you know, that's the only thing that you need to be concerned about. Let me just look at the Q&A thing here. What is your so one question here is about injera. What's my take on injera? Injera is exactly the same concept, except that, you know, typically instead of using whole grains, soaking them whole, and then blending them, usually with injera, you start with flour. But that's the only difference. And then you mix flour and water together. Typically no starter is used, and then it's just allowed to sit until it rises. And then that's the batter that you make injera out of. And then, you know, the process for making the pancakes out of injera is a little bit different. The most important difference with injera is that you'd never flip it. You only cook it on one side, and you need a steaming top over the whole thing so that it cooks. But and injera generally is a little bit of a thicker pancake, so you're making a little bit of a thicker batter, but otherwise it's like exactly the same idea. The bacteria and yeast that are found on the grains are rising it up. Just like here, we're relying on the bacteria and yeast that are on the lentils and rice to rise it up. And here now I'm going to show you, this is the batch that I started yesterday, and you can see this little like matrix of bubbles. So, I mean, that's what's telling us that it's risen, plus that I put a piece of tape at the level where it was yesterday, and then I can see that it's rising up. And if it was a warmer day, it would have risen a little bit higher. How much it rises is not ultimately that important. You just want to see that there's a critical mass of activity that's rising it up. Now, if you left it for too long, just like a loaf of bread that's rising, it could sort of hit its peak, and then the yeast would exhaust their nutrients, and then the whole thing would start to collapse. You don't want to let it ferment for that long. So once it doubles, it's getting close to exhausting its potential. So I have these friends who have a Dosa food truck in Vermont, and they just make batter once a week, fermented for about 24 hours, and then they store it in the refrigerator. And that's what I do also, is like when I make some Dosa batter, I ferment it. I make some Dosa generally with it when it's nice and fresh, but then I'll just store it in the refrigerator. And for, the next week, I'll just make myself Dosas whenever I want. So let's see, how thick is the blender ingredients? Well, let's see. I mean, it's a liquid. I mean, it's definitely, like, we don't want it to, we're adding enough water that it can all blend down and become a pourable liquid. We're going to be trying to make a crepe, but we don't want it to be watery thin, otherwise it won't have any structure to it. So, for making the batter, typically my rule of thumb is add as little of the soaking water as possible to get it to blend. And then when I make the dosas, I might end up adding a little bit more water. If the first dosa seems like it's too thick and I want it to be runnier, then I'll add a little bit more water. But you add water just a little bit at a time, because the worst thing that can happen is you make it too thin. When using larger legumes such as lima beans, do you just soak them or do you cook them to blend? No, just soak them. I mean, all legumes are like this. They expand and they soften when you soak them. Like, you don't cook them before you make the batter. If you cook them before you make the batter, then you're going to kill the organisms that you're relying on to drive the fermentation. The one thing I forgot to mention is that with the lentils, I always put a pinch of fenugreek. What did I do with my, here's my fenugreek. So, these tiny little seeds that are used as a seasoning in Indian cuisine. So I just put like a few grains of fenugreek, like a tiny little pinch into it. I didn't do that for years. It's definitely not necessary, but I sort of ran into enough, Indian and Indian descended people who mentioned that as part of how they do it, that I just started doing it. And it's a flavor that I enjoy. It seems to maybe make the fermentation a little bit more vigorous. So I have come to always add a little pinch of fenugreek. Okay, we've made our batter. Now, this is yesterday's batter that has risen, and I always like to sort of use a piece of tape or a Sharpie to sort of mark where my line is, where the level of the batter is, so I can gauge how much it's risen. The one other ingredient that we need to add, and I typically don't add it, I've done it both ways, but today I didn't add salt at the beginning because it was kind of chilly here. And, the cooler it is, the slower the metabolism of all these organisms, the warmer it is, the faster it is. So when I make these in the summer, I usually add my salt at the beginning to the batter, just because it's so hot and things are going so fast, that slows it down a little bit. When it's chilly and, I have a deadline, like, I'm teaching a workshop and I want to show this off, or I'm having people over for dinner and I want to make sure that it's fermented in time, like, then I'll wait and add salt just before I cook it. I am not terribly methodical about this. I'm going to take a pinch of salt. and put it in. And then what I always do is I'll make my first pancake, and then I'll evaluate the flavor and decide if I need to add more salt. And sometimes I'll add more water also. I would say based on the thickness of this batter, I'm going to go ahead and just add a little bit of water right now. So I see a question about what kind of rice. Any kind of white or brown rice is fine. Actually, I mean, usually I use white rice, either a jasmine rice or a basmati rice. It happens that when I soaked this yesterday, I was out of white rice, so I did this with brown rice. So I mean, that's definitely non-traditional. I'm sure that we could find people from different places in the south of India who would like sort of say that there's a specific kind of rice that you should use. I mean, generally in people's food traditions there is some like specificity to it. But in my playing around with this, my general observation is, you can not only use any kind of rice, you could use any kind of grain. So now this is the batter we have. And now I'm like, I added some water, added some salt, I'm stirring it around. And now I'm going to switch cameras and turn around and go to my stove and make a dosa. Oh, okay, the batter didn't double, or did it? How do you know it's ready? Well, I mean, it rose about 25%. So that's totally fine. Like, it doesn't need to double. Like, doubling is about what its potential is. I mean, I've seen it double many, many times, which is why I would say you always want to use a jar that's at least, or a vessel that's at least twice the size of the volume of batter that you have. But especially in cooler weather, you might not see it double, and you don't really have to wait until it totally doubles. As long as it is sort of visibly expanding and has this kind of bubble matrix that I was trying to show you, then you can make it. You can leave it a few hours longer, and once it's in that sort of rising trajectory, it'll keep on rising. But if you see that it's getting near doubling, and you're not ready to make your dosas, then I would say you want to move it to the refrigerator so that it doesn't exhaust all of the nutrients that are available to it, because you want a little bit of a rise while it's cooking. You don't want to exhaust all of the potential for it to rise. So now I'm going to go to the stove and I'll show you how I make a dosa. And then we'll have time for any other kinds of questions about this, or any other related topics. So I've had my pan on a low heat. So you want a hot pan. I use a crepe pan. It's nice to have something with low sides so you can get under it. Something with higher sides is harder to get under. The mistake that I made for years in trying to learn how to make dosas was I was working with a pan that was too oily. So I would just I would just squirt all this oil into it, and then they would always stick. And what I finally learned is that less oil is better. And I learned from an Indian woman who I met this idea of using an onion. An onion has oils in it, and then the oil will also help you redistribute the oil if there's some on the pan. So rather than actually putting oil directly on the pan, I just use an onion cut on half, and then I'm going to end up chopping up this onion and putting it into my dinner. But that's how I oil the pan. And then I'm just going to take some of this batter. Usually I'll do 2 of these scoops onto the pan. And then go ahead and just use my wrist action to spread it. Okay, so I can already tell that I'm going to have to add a little bit more water to this. Like it didn't spread as far as I wanted to do, and that's just a question of how much water is in it. So, you know, after this, I'll add a little bit more water. You can see that these little bubbles are appearing. That's a sign that like there's fermentation happening, you know, as a result of the heat on the pan. And then I'm not sure if you can see it, but I can see that from the thinnest part of the edge, the color is beginning to change. And the color will change, darken from the edges towards the center. So I try to just, you know, let it sit while the color is changing. I like to just make sure that it's not sticking. Okay, this is beautiful. And just wait another moment while the color changes. Okay. And then you can see that it's like a nice golden color on the cooked side. And then we just wait for it to cook on the other side. Then meanwhile, I'm just going to take a little bit more water and thin this out a little bit more so that the next dosa will be thinner. When I have dosa batter, a favorite breakfast I like to do is after I turn it over like this, and so I have a cooked side exposed facing up, I'll take an egg, crack an egg, put it right in the middle, and then I have this lid that goes over it, and I'll sort of steam the egg cooking on the top. So, you know, that's just you know, one way to do it. You know, then, you know, I always like to make kind of, you know, chutneys or other kinds of sauces. But you know, like if you order dosa in a South Indian restaurant, it always comes with some stuffing, and then it's sort of, you know, rolled up or folded over. And so that's usually what I do. And it might just be like, you know, the leftovers that I had for dinner last night. I mean, it's not necessarily a classic South Indian kind of a dish, although sometimes it is. So that basically is the dosa. You just want to peek at the other side and make sure that that's cooked. And so here we have a nice steaming dosa. Okay, now I'm going to turn this off and go back to the other camera. I'm going to show you all one other thing, which is with that same batter. A dosa is like a crepe. With that same batter, you can make a steamed bread. And that's,
hey, Sandor.
That's called, you want me to turn off the phone?
I think we need to mute the phone.
Okay, just listen. Now, am I okay? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, this brave new world of online teaching. So this is an Italy steamer. And so this has 6 layers. Each of the layers is like this. There are 4 indentations in each layer, and you would put a little scoop of batter. For Italy, you would leave that batter a little bit thicker. For dosas, because you want it to be this thin crepe, you would add a little bit more water to thin it out. So the only difference between Italy batter and dosa batter is that the Italy batter needs to be a little bit thicker. But you put a little scoop of the batter in each of your oiled indentations, and then you put this in a pot that has a tight fitting lid. Put ½ an inch of water at the bottom, put this in, cover it, and then just steam it for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then you have the dosas out of the same batter. My favorite gluten-free bread is made with buckwheat, just raw groats of buckwheat. And I'll take about 3 cups of the buckwheat groats, soak them overnight. Same thing, like they'll swell up, it'll activate these dormant microorganisms that are present. Then I'll drain out that water because it's very mucilaginous. And then I'll put it in the blender with some fresh water and make a batter out of that. Give that 24 hours of fermentation, add some salt. Sometimes I might add other things, sesame seeds, or, you know, other tasty things. and then bake it into a loaf of bread, or alternatively make pancakes just like this. So, although, I'm really trying to showcase a specific South Indian tradition, this basic method of soaking grains and beans, in water. The water activates the dormant organisms that are present, but that are dormant because it's dry. That begins pre-digesting things, rising things up, creating some lactic acid, which gives it a lovely flavor. And then you can cook it, after it's fermented a little bit. So this is like a general pattern. Okay. Do you seal it completely with a lid on while it ferments, or will a towel do? I would say this is one of the most asked questions in fermentation, and mostly it doesn't matter. So here's the thing, is like, okay, if you ask a biologist what is fermentation, the biologist will tell you fermentation is anaerobic metabolism, the production of energy without oxygen. In its contemporary usage, we've come to also call fermentation any kind of microbial transformation, whether it needs oxygen or not. But the vast majority of fermentation processes do not need oxygen. Now, they'll off-gas a little bit, but for a 24-hour fermentation, there's just not enough accumulation of the gases that it's going to create any kind of a problem. So, generally, my MO is to leave it open, but it doesn't have to be that way. So you can cover it with a cloth. You can leave it completely open. You can seal it into a jar, as you like. Do I use water with or without chlorine? I am so lucky to live in a place with a natural spring. So I have spring water, and I've basically had spring water for the entire time that I've been playing around with fermentation, and so I definitely use non-chlorinated water. I've met people who say, "Oh, I've been baking bread, I've been making beer, I've been making whatever, using chlorinated water forever." So, I mean, the thing is that, most chlorinated water does not have enough chlorine, that when you add a little bit of water to something, it's going to destroy the fermentation. But in general, I would say, but sometimes it does. I also hear stories of people who feel like the water that they used ruined their fermentation. If you possibly can, use dechlorinated water. A simple inline filter, like a carbon filter, does a great job of removing most of the chlorine. Chlorine is also volatile, so if you can anticipate your needs and just leave the water out in a bowl or a pot overnight, most of the chlorine will evaporate. You can do that faster by boiling the water, and the chlorine will evaporate out. The problem is that a lot of municipal systems have switched from chlorine to a compound called chloramine. That's a chlorine and ammonia compound that's not volatile. It still can be filtered out, but it won't just evaporate into the air. So if you have any questions about your municipal system, I have no idea whether Bend is using chlorine or chloramine, but if you call your local water utility or even look on their website, you can probably find it. And if you call them, they certainly could tell you whether they're using chlorine or chloramine. But if you have access to a spring or a well, I would say that would be the ideal scenario, is to use water like that. Do you ever add spices to the batter? Well, I said that I added fenugreek. Sure, I've played around a little bit with adding other spices to the batter, but generally I've come to the place where I add spices to, I make sauces for, I make chutneys or sauces. And so, I sort of would rather put my spices into that than into the part that's going to get cooked. But there's no reason not to play around with that and, try spices in the batter. You mentioned something that sounded like injera. Can you spell that? That's the name of the Italian dosa. No. Injera is Ethiopian. So that's Ethiopian sponge bread. Injera is usually how I have seen it spelled. I have an injera recipe as well as a dosa recipe here in my book, Wild Fermentation. This was my original book that was published in 2003 and that I updated in 2016. I also have a section about Italy and Dosa, and for that matter, also Injera in my book, The Art of Fermentation. I have a brand new book that's actually not how to make anything, but it's called Fermentation as Metaphor. And it's really, kind of a reflection about, ideas related to fermentation. And of course, in the English language, we use fermentation to describe, any phenomenon that's bubbly and agitated. So, you can have, artistic fermentation, musical fermentation, spiritual fermentation, political fermentation, cultural fermentation. And so this book is sort of exploring some of those ideas, but you will not find any recipes in this book. And then I have one other book, which is called The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved: Inside America's Underground Food Movements. So, so check out my books. What was the steamed bread called? Could you spell it? Sure. Okay. So Dosa, D-O-S-A, is the crepe, the fry bread. And then the steamed bread from the same batter is called idli, usually spelled I-D-L-I, but that is a transliteration, and I have seen quite a bit of variation. I've seen I-D-L-E-E. But usually it's transliterated as I-D-L-I, idli. And then there are other related foods in Indian cuisine. There's something called dokla. There's a Sri Lankan wonderful thing called hoppers. That's like rice mixed with toddy, which is like fermented coconut sap. And they make these like breads. They make it in something sort of shaped like a wok. So the upper edges of it are crispy, like a crispy lattice, and then the central part that's like lower in the hopper's pan is a little bit thicker and spongier. In China at markets, I saw foods, just like these that were sort of made from a fermented batter of rice. So, I mean, I think that in a lot of, cuisines that use rice as a staple, that, you'll find, variations of this idea. Okay. So here I'm seeing more questions on the chat.
I think one of the more recent questions that was accidentally skipped was, could you freeze the dosas?
I mean, I've never done that. I mean, for me, like, the pleasure of them is as a fresh, warm thing. So I'm not sure why you would want to freeze them, but I don't know that you couldn't freeze them. I've had great results with like keeping the batter in the refrigerator. So I make a batch of batter, and then I might, have dosas on and off for the next like week or 10 days. But I've never tried like making the dosas and putting them in the freezer. I mean, I don't know how you would reheat them exactly. I don't know. They're so good fresh. So, I mean, I don't know.
Okay.
The internet's a great source. I'm sure there are Indian families who have either had terrible failures or wonderful successes freezing extra dosas.
But it kind of sounds like, same concept of leaving a sourdough jar, a jar of sourdough in the fridge, just ready to go when you want it.
Yeah, but I mean, the reality of keeping a sourdough in the fridge is it's not ready when you want it. It's like, It's ready for you to, wind it up for a day or two before you're ready to use it. So yeah, it's a great way to keep us. I mean, I have a sourdough in my fridge, that I started 25 years ago. But I can't just take it out of the fridge and make bread. I have to like take it out of the fridge, give it a feeding the next day. So I think of it as like winding it up. So it'll be able to have the force to be able to rise bread. But I mean, one of the beautiful things about methods like this is that you don't need an ongoing starter. You just decide, okay, this week I'm going to make dosas, and it doesn't mean that I have this thing that I have to take care of for the rest of my life. I'm just going to make dosas this week, and then that'll be done. And then in a few weeks, I might feel like it again, and I'll make dosas again. And it's only, I mean, in a cool temperate climate, you know, I would think of it as like a 36-hour process. You have an overnight soak, and that could be for as long as 24 hours. And then you turn it into a batter and let it rise. And, you know, in South India, in tropical temperatures, in a warm week in the summertime here in Tennessee where I live, or I mean, in a warm week in the summer in Bend for that matter, I mean, it might rise in, you know, 8 hours. But in more typical temperatures, you have to assume that it'll take 24 hours. And, you know, let's say it's in the 50s and you're not heating your kitchen, it could take 2 days. So like, you know, at let's say, you know, 68 degrees, it might take 24 hours. But if your kitchen is cooler, it could take a significantly longer period of time. But don't lose faith. It will happen. So a question about how I would serve dosas. So yeah, sure. I mean, it's something like a tortilla or like naan. But yeah, I mean, the way I've seen it typically served in a restaurant is you put some, you know, like a masala dish or something on it, and then you fold it over, and then you might have some chutney or something, and that's usually how I use it also. You know, lots of different ways. But yeah, sure. I mean, like any kind of a flatbread, it's a wonderful vehicle for other kinds of delicious things. And, you know, you put, you know, I mentioned when I was over there that I like to fry an egg right on it. And so maybe I like fry an egg on it and then put a little bit of chutney and then like, you know, fold it over and just break the yolk and it all gets juicy and I make a mess on my beard while I'm eating it. But it's all super delicious. So sure, I mean, you could think of it as like, you know, analogous to a tortilla, and that's often how I've seen it served in an Indian context. Okay, here we someone saying I enjoy dosa with seasoned, slightly mashed potatoes, cooked cauliflower, and green beans. Now, there was one question: would freezing eliminate the benefit of the fermentation? So, a lot of people, you know, imagine that the benefit of the fermentation is the probiotics. Well, if you want to eat this dough raw, which doesn't seem at all appealing to me, I mean, that'll be teeming with bacteria and probiotics. When you cook it, you're destroying those bacteria, but that doesn't mean that there's not a benefit to the fermentation. You know, there are many different benefits to fermentation. Probiotics is one of them, but only a small subset of fermented foods are probiotic, and those are the foods that are not cooked or heat processed after their fermentation. But, you know, in the case of a batter made from raw grains and beans, in every tradition, that would be cooked before you eat it. So it's just a food that, like a loaf of bread, just intrinsically does not have living bacteria. But, you know, there's lots of other benefits to the fermentation. The bioavailability of the minerals in the grains is a benefit of the fermentation. The lightness from the rising, so the pleasing texture, is a benefit of the fermentation. The sourness, adding complexity to the flavor, is a benefit of the fermentation. So, I mean, there's lots of benefits to the fermentation, and probiotics are only one of them. And, you know, not every food really lends itself to, you know, to eating raw. Certain foods really need to be cooked before you eat them. Okay, another question came up here. What do the Italians call dosas? Okay, I don't know, probably dosas. I mean, it's not an Italian thing, it's an Indian thing. So I might have been confusing people when I was talking about dosas and idli, because Idli, I-D-L-I, sounds a little bit like Italy, I-T-A-L-Y, but they're completely different. So I don't know, I'm sure there's some South Indian restaurants in India, but I would assume they call dosas dosas and they call idlis idlis. I'm very happy to address other kinds of fermentation questions. If anyone has any. I also have all kinds of like fermented goodies or projects right around me. I can show you. So I mean, I just showed you like a jar of sauerkraut. This is about as basic as it gets. You know, actually on the other side of my camera is this big crock of kimchi, but it's like too heavy for me to even pick up right now. But I spent a lot of the day, you know, cleaning garlic and ginger and scallions and chili peppers and like making the spice mix to mix in with vegetables that I had prepared yesterday and had in a brine. What's a good source to learn more about Chinese ferments? Okay, well that's a really interesting question. So I mean, China has some of the most elaborate fermentation traditions in the world. But you know, relatively little has been written in the English language about it. I mean, there's a great scholarly book that's part of the Cambridge University Science and Civilization series. And I can't off the top of my head tell you what volume in that series it is, but it's called Fermentation and Food Science. And so it's basically like a look at fermentation over the, like a historical look at fermentation in China. And you know, it's a really like fat book, you know, full of historical information, but not so much contemporary information, not so many recipes. I would recommend, so I went to China 4 years ago with a friend of mine who lives in Colorado, Mara King. She was raised in Hong Kong and her mother still lives in Hong Kong. And her mother took us to this village in Guizhou that she's been visiting for 25 years, and where, I mean, it's a really remote village, you know, largely subsistence, and people do a lot of fermentation there. And we did we did some other traveling in southwestern China, but we produced a series of 8 short videos. They're on YouTube. They're called People's Republic of Fermentation. Each one is about 10 minutes long, and each one focuses on a different aspect of Chinese fermentation, and then there are recipes that go along with each of them. And my friend Mara is actually at work on a book about Chinese fermentations, but you know, that's a couple of years out, so that's not available yet. And then the other thing I would say is if there's specific fermentation processes from China that you hear about or interested in, there are, you know, all these amazing, you know, young Chinese women making instructional videos on YouTube. And they've realized that, you know, they can earn a little bit of an income by sort of showing people how to make some traditional Chinese foods. So not only fermentation oriented, but lots of Chinese foods, like, you know, if you can spell the name right, you can like find a video of how to make it. So that's another possible way to learn. What is in that kraut? Carrots. I tried carrots once and I got mushy. Yeah, I mean, this is red cabbage, green cabbage, and some carrots, maybe some onion also. I like to mix things together. I mean, any vegetables have the potential to become mushy. It's a matter of enzymes. There are what makes vegetables crispy and crunchy are pectins, and there are enzymes that are collectively known as pectinase enzymes that are in vegetables, and they can break down the pectins. So salt inhibits them. The more salt you use, the slower those enzymes will be. Cool environment is the best way to not worry about those enzymes. I once had 3-year-old kimchi that had been in a cellar in Vermont. and really stayed the earth temperature for 3 years, and it was crispy, nice. But sure, any vegetable has the potential to get soft and mushy, but it's not like intrinsic to the carrot. It's about it was hot, you used very little salt or something like that. So I like to incorporate carrots sometimes. I like to incorporate color. So that could be different things. Do I rinse the rice and lentils before soaking them? No, I usually don't. I mean, nothing would be wrong with that. You don't have to worry about like washing the bacteria away, but no, I typically don't do that. When you have multiple different ferments going in your kitchen, for example, sourdough starter and sauerkraut, can they sit on the counter next to each other? Absolutely, absolutely. There's a business that's still in business selling food cultures, but it was the first one in the US who was doing that. It's called Gem Cultures, and it was started by a woman named Betty Steckmeyer, who I got to be friends with. She doesn't run it anymore. Her daughter runs the business now, but Betty had a 12-foot square commercial kitchen in her basement, and she was propagating so many different kinds of, she was making kombucha, kefir, koji. She was making her own tempeh starter. I mean, she was just making so many different kinds of ferments in this one kitchen, and she swears that in 30 years of doing that commercially, she never experienced any cross-contamination. People project that anxiety onto fermentation a lot. I mean, sure, if you have a brewery and you're working with a pure culture yeast, I understand why you might not want people to sort of be bringing other kinds of bacteria-rich things in. But most fermentations, and certainly all traditional fermentations, are working with these communities of organisms from the food themselves. So, the exposure to some other organisms in the air is going to be very minor compared to the critical mass of those organisms that's on the food itself. So in general, it's not something that you have to worry about too much. So I wouldn't worry about it. Do I ferment my sauces, chutneys, and ketchup? I mean, I've played around a little bit with fermenting chutneys, and had good experiences with it. But I don't typically ferment chutneys. Ketchup, I've played around with it, but I don't typically do that. Tips for avoiding calm yeast in fermentation. Well, okay, so calm yeast is an aerobic life form. So I talked earlier about the idea that, in general, fermentation is anaerobic metabolism, the production of energy without oxygen. And so, in the kraut, we're getting the vegetables submerged to protect them from oxygen, but there's always a surface. Unless you have like a very cleverly engineered vessel that's designed to protect the surface from oxygen, there's going to be some oxygen at the surface, and you might, especially in warm weather, especially for things that ferment for a long time, get this sort of like layer on the top. It's like this beige, wavy layer. It's totally harmless. You don't have to worry about it. I mean, the big ways to avoid it are to use some of these, engineered vessels that protect the surface from oxygen. But, I mostly don't use those because I am compulsively interested in looking, smelling, tasting my ferments as they develop. And so all of these clever designs, anytime you open it to smell it or taste it, you're letting the oxygen in. So if you're opening it all the time, you're defeating the purpose of the cleverly engineered vessel. So I just don't worry about it. I just skim it off if it forms, and don't worry about it. One technique that I saw in China. So this is outside. So this is like a Chinese style of fermenting vegetables where you make a brine, and then a spiced brine, and then it becomes a perpetual brine that you put vegetables in and take them out of. And the woman who showed us how to make pao tsai had a brine that was several years old, and she told us that if she ever got a little bloom on the surface of it, she would put a little bit of distilled spirits, liquor, baijiu, which is this Chinese style liquor. She would just put a little bit of it in, and then what happens is alcohol is lighter than water, so it floats to the top, and so you have the highest concentration of alcohol right at the top, which just kills it. So that's like a Chinese approach to calm yeast. Generally I just skim it off and try not to worry about it. Have you ever tried soda while ferment? I'm not sure what, hi ML, I'm not sure what you mean by soda. Do you mean like bicarbonate of soda? But I mean, I have no idea. I mean, my answer would be no. I've never tried any kind of soda fermenting cucumbers. This summer, I had a great crop of cucumbers. I made a lot of pickles. Pickles were my gateway into fermentation. As a child growing up in New York City, I loved pickles, and I still do. Pickles are the hardest cucumbers are the hardest vegetables to ferment because they're so prone to getting soft. So, I mean, my major technique is to, if you're growing them yourself, just, pick them and ferment them, get them under the brine in the same day. Don't give them a lot of time in between. Every cucumber has a stem end and a blossom end. I use a little paring knife and just scrape away any residue of the blossom end on each cucumber. Then I like to soak them in ice water for an hour or two. And then I always use grape leaves, and the tannins in the grape leaves slow down these enzymes that can make the cucumbers get soft and mushy. So grape leaves, then I usually use garlic and dill. Flowering heads are ideal, but dill seeds work fine also. And then I usually pack the vegetables into the jar, and then I'll prepare half of the capacity of the jar in brine. Like the idea is like when you add your brine solution, your salt water, you want to add as little water as possible to cover the vegetables. So you want less than half of the volume to be the brine. So usually I'll mix a 5% brine, and what that means is the 5% of the weight of the water in salt. So it's much easier in the metric system than it is in our US system, but a liter of water weighs a kilogram. So 50 grams of salt for a liter of water makes a 5% brine. And then just use as much of that brine as you need to cover the vegetables. And then if it's really hot, then you have to give it a very short fermentation. Like, in a hot environment, if you leave it for 2 weeks, they're just going to be mushy, even with the grape leaves, even with 5% salt. So in hot weather, I just watch for when the color changes from a bright green of a fresh cucumber to the duller olive green, and then I'll taste it, and then evaluate the sourness every day or two, but I'm also evaluating the texture. And at the first hint that it's beginning to get softer, I'll put it in the fridge, put it in the back of the fridge, let it continue slowly fermenting for a couple more weeks, and then I'll eat them. And actually in my fridge right now, I have the last of the pickles from the summer, these little cucumbers called Mexican sour gherkins, and they just ferment so well. Well, anyway, I have gone past our time, and so it's been lovely sharing this with you all. I hope some of you are inspired to make some dosas. As you can see, it's really a simple, straightforward process, and be fearless in your experimentation. Fermentation is fun, fermentation is delicious, and fermentation lends itself to experimentation. You do not have to, sort of follow every recipe exactly. Interpret it as you like. So thank you, Laurel, for inviting me. This has been wonderful. Hi, Lizzie.
Thank you so much, Sandor. I've always appreciated how much you allow for creativity and what you have, and embracing that spirit of just
what do you got in your fridge? What do you have in your pantry? Do it. And I think a lot of people, like me, have a hard time walking away from a recipe. But once you do, I think it's a brave new world.
But I mean, what I would just say to that, I mean, thank you, but I also just want to say, like, this is the history of fermentation, is people taking what's abundant in their environment and working with that, you know, and not with like sort of precious special ingredients that come from faraway places. It's just like, what do you do with the things that are, you know, easy for you to grow in your environment?
Right. And they're delicious.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, Sandor. And for you in the audience, thank you for joining us. You can find out more programs from the Deschutes Public Library that are all fun, free, and virtual at deschuteslibrary.org or at our monthly event guide. And you can see programs or recordings of programs that you've missed. This program will be is being recorded, and the video link will be available. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and may your experiments of fermentation be delicious. Bye, everyone.
Nice.